Amal Clooney and Ted Boutros, welcome and congratulations on winning the 2021 Press Freedom Award. I've got to say, it couldn't be more well-deserved. You two are amazing when it comes to work for press freedom, and it's really great to have a chance to chat today. Naturally, threats to press freedom are on our minds today, and I'd like to start by asking you, Ted, about a potential concern here in America. As you know, of course, two Supreme Court justices, Clarence Thomas and Neil Gorsuch, have recently questioned the continued application of New York Times versus Sullivan. And I think that kind of shocked the press freedom community. Do you see a serious threat to the constitutional principle that a public figure has to prove actual malice or reckless disregard of the truth to prevail in a libel suit?
It was shocking when those two justices issued those opinions, because New York Times versus Sullivan really is the bedrock of First Amendment jurisprudence in the United States. And to have a Supreme Court justice even breathe the words that it should be reconsidered is scary. I don't think there's a real risk in the near term that the Supreme Court would do that. Justice Alito, another conservative member of the court, recently, last year, I guess it was, he dissented from the denial of a case, review of a case that would have raised Times versus Sullivan issues, and he extolled the virtues of the decision. But it really is dangerous, and I think there is a plan afoot in certain quarters to try in the long term to get Times versus Sullivan overturned, and that would just be terrible.
So just to push a bit on that, Times v. Sullivan is 1964. That's a long time ago. And there's just been so many changes in the news industry, in the social media, the proliferation of misinformation, and just how much has changed in news technology. Is New York Times versus Sullivan still relevant? Is it time to reconsider it in some way?
My view is we've never needed it more. We saw an outbreak of libel suits brought by public figures, by President Trump's campaign, President Trump threatening libel suits, Congressman Nunes using a spate of libel suits to attack the media and to try to chill the press. So I think we need Times versus Sullivan now more than ever. And since 1964, it's been upheld and expanded over and over again by the Supreme Court. In Hustler versus Falwell, Chief Justice Rehnquist wrote a unanimous decision for the court. Justice Scalia joined it. It's a powerful, important precedent. And the two justices who question Times versus Sullivan, I think, misunderstand what's going on social media. There was some expressed concern that there's disinformation out there, but that doesn't have anything to do with the actual malice standard. That would fall outside it anyway. So I think we need Times versus Sullivan. We need to strengthen First Amendment protections.
Great, thank you. Amal, it's really great to have you here. Thanks for joining.
Thank you so much.
I wanted to talk about the Maria Ressa case, to move thousands of miles away. Maria, of course, is the founder and CEO of the highly independent Philippine news site Rappler. And since, I guess, back in 2018, the Duterte government has brought multiple charges, which I think are clearly very spurious charges against her for things like cyber libel, tax evasion, securities fraud, and you're representing her. So tell us what this case is about and why should people care about it?
Well, thanks for the question. You know, it's actually not so far removed from what we've just been talking about. The Filipino system actually tries to apply New York Times versus Sullivan. So, you know, I think we should always be aware when talking about what's happening in the US that the world is watching, and many systems are inspired by US law in this area, and others, of course, as well. So the ripple effect will be felt far and wide if there's any substantial lowering of the protections in the United States. But as you say, Maria Ressa, so she is, you know, she's 5'2", and I've said before she stands taller than so many of us in her noble pursuit of the truth. And she has faced devastating consequences basically just for being a good journalist. You know, she's a Filipino-American woman. She studied at Princeton. She became the CNN bureau chief in Asia and was Time Person of the Year. And as a result of essentially exposing abuses by the government in the Philippines, she became you know, the primary target of that government. And, you know, her case is actually emblematic. It illustrates a whole host of threats that are being faced by journalists all over the world. So it starts with an online campaign against her of sort of hate messages and to try and discredit her. It leads to civil suits which try to bankrupt her news organization, and then ultimately the threat of criminal penalties. So she's actually already been convicted of cyber libel, for which she faces up to 6 years in prison, and a whole host of other spurious, supposedly financial crimes that expose her to a lifetime behind bars. She is determined to fight. It takes up a huge amount of her time, and it takes a big legal team. I'm working with some of the top lawyers in the US in trying to defend her alongside Manila Council, but she's not safe so long as there isn't a proper system in place internationally to make sure that when journalists are abused in their own countries and their own system can't protect them, they have a way out. And so it's really very troubling. I mean, all of the work that she does is about trying to improve the landscape for not only herself, but all journalists in her country and in Asia to be able to report freely. So I very much hope we can keep her safe.
Well, absolutely. And I know everybody in the community is appreciative that you're working on the case. I wanted to focus on one thing you said, talking about online harassment, because that's something that's affecting journalists everywhere in the world and also in the US, of course. And I was just wondering, since we're talking about legal protections, does anything in the law, starting with the US, currently provide any recourse to victims of these online attacks? Women especially are being subjected to them. Is legislation needed? Maybe Ted, if you could start just talking a little bit about potential recourse for this online harassment.
It really is a terrible problem, and women in particular, female journalists, get harassed and attacked. It's a new form of chilling journalism that's even more frightening, because they're oftentimes physical threats, violent threats, and there are laws. There are cyber stalking laws in some states. There's a federal law that can be applied in this context, but they're not really used as much as they should be. They're not prosecuted. And so what I think we need is a more concentrated law enforcement effort to go after people who do this. And oftentimes people are anonymous, so you have to figure out who they are, but we need the authorities to focus on those people. That's the kind of disinformation and wrongful conduct that needs to be stopped. And so I do think we need a more concentrated effort to go after those people.
Yeah. Amal, any thoughts on this on a global scale?
I mean, just to say, yeah, it's a real issue. And I think female journalists in particular are often targeted with these kinds of campaigns. They're obviously often made to look like it's lots of diverse individuals, but really it's a government-sponsored effort. And I think it's been really helpful when investigative groups have been able to reveal this is just the government behind all of these accounts. But I know for Maria, for example, she at one stage was subjected to 90 hate messages per minute. And many of them were sort of misogynistic in content, and there's a huge issue now in the Philippines and elsewhere with red tagging, and you think you're talking about something that's decades old, but people being branded as communists and terrorists, and it can really ruin lives. People like Maria are incredibly courageous, but we can't expect people to withstand this kind of abuse just in order to go to work every day. It just can't work. So definitely a big issue. And I think just starting with exposing who's really behind the effort, with the help of the tech companies, is definitely one step in the right direction.
Right, thank you. Of course, a conversation like this has to come around to Donald Trump at some point. The press was persistently attacked during his presidency. He's not president now. So do each of you think he did long-term damage to press freedom, or was it just during his administration? And also, was that damage, if it occurred just in the US, or does it have kind of tendrils outside the US? Molly, you want to start with that?
Well, I mean, let's look at the figures. We're dealing with, the highest rates of journalists being killed around the world, being imprisoned around the world. We know 9 out of 10 journalist murders are unpunished. And I think, Donald Trump, his rhetoric in relation to the media at home definitely emboldened autocrats abroad to feel that they could get away with this kind of behavior. You know, he praised you know, people like Putin and or gave cover to MBS and the Dutertes of the world. So clearly you know, we heard leaders in places like Cambodia invoke Trump's language when clamping down on their own press. So those kinds of connections are easy to draw, and the figures in terms of where we've reached are clear. I think what we're also seeing, and I'm pretty sure that the sort of Trump era contributed to this, is what I would call a new era of shamelessness, if we can call it that. You know, seeing the Belarus leaders feel that, you know, they can divert a commercial airline in midair and ground it in order to arrest a journalist and put them in prison. Seeing that a journalist, a Washington Post columnist, can be chopped up in an embassy in the middle of the day in Turkey. And ultimately the message from Western democracies going back to this behavior is that not very much is going to happen as a result. So I do worry about the legacy of President Trump. And I think that means that the Biden administration has to do, you know, a lot to reverse the damage before we can move forward. You know, I'm heartened that the administration, the current administration, has made sort of democracy and promoting democracy the centerpiece of its foreign policy, and they're proposing to host a democracy summit. And obviously protecting democracy means protecting the press. So they've said it's a priority in the rhetoric, and I hope that what we'll see is concerted action as a result.
Ted, do you want to take that too? Just what do you see as the legacy of what Donald Trump has done?
I agree with them all that Donald Trump really has damaged freedom of the press around the world. He's labeling the press the enemy of the people, really conducting a disinformation campaign, a campaign of falsity from the White House for 4 years and more, incalculable damage, taking action against the press, politicizing Voice of America and making it look like a true arm of the state. We had to sue and work with the Reporters Committee on that case and won. And so it really is a way to, it's had a delegitimizing effect on journalism. It's caused the public to not trust journalists and journalism. And that really hurts democracy, as Amal was saying. So I think it's a real problem. It's a lasting problem, and we've got to fight back.
Do you so far, Ted, feel like the Biden administration is moving in good direction? Do you have any areas of disappointment in terms of the priority being paid to these issues?
I do think the Biden administration is a huge improvement, including Attorney General Garland and the new guidelines for subpoenas to reporters and the like. But what I'd love to see is President Biden on a trip make a soaring speech about freedom of the press and how important it is for citizens of any country to be able to learn what's happening and what the government is doing, and so they can participate in the government. And I think that would, I haven't heard that for, it's been a long time. And I think that would be a really great thing for President Biden to do.
And one area where there's been criticism so far is Afghanistan. And certainly people have raised the question of whether the administration has done enough for particularly Afghan journalists trying to leave Afghanistan, often journalists who work closely with US news organizations. Either of you have any thoughts on that, or are there things that still need to be done in terms of Afghanistan? Well,
look, I think Afghanistan has thrown into sharp relief the problems that journalists are facing in many parts of the world. I think that, you know, it's been heartbreaking and to watch it unravel on our screens, of course, but and I hope that the US will take extra measures there, given the history. But I believe there are a number of policy initiatives that the US and that democracies can take that would help in general, and that we need a system in place. You know, in the same way that autocrats have become very sophisticated, they have a system of unfair laws and they're united in using them. and in improving their techniques. We need a system to respond to that. And we have to stop acting like we're surprised each time, autocrats clamp down on journalists, or, regimes like the Taliban are taking, measures to abuse women. We need a proper system in place. And one clear example is emergency visas for vulnerable populations. It's just obvious that journalists sometimes, the only way to keep them safe is to get them out of a country. And it's not that difficult for a democracy to say, I'm going to allow every year, this many journalists to come in. So now Canada has said, for example, we'll let 200 journalists, human rights defenders, including journalists in. The Netherlands has stepped up and said, we will also start a new program for journalists. And of course, there are other vulnerable populations that could be the beneficiaries of similar programs. And, I think one of the messages to the Taliban and other regimes of that nature should also be, we're watching you and there will be consequences if you violate human rights. And again, it's not rocket science. That leaders will care if they have targeted sanctions imposed on them. So if they suddenly can't access the US dollar, the international financial markets, they can't travel to New York, they care about that. And we need to start just institutionalizing a response so that every time certain abuses happen, this is the response that is received. So I think it should be in place for the Taliban. I think it should be in place elsewhere. And the last thing, Steve, is there should be proper investigations and prosecutions for criminal behavior. And that means that where the national system can't do it, that means supporting the International Criminal Court in The Hague, which at the moment, by the way, has jurisdiction over crimes committed in Afghanistan. But that means supporting their prosecutions no matter who's committing the crimes, and supporting the idea of international rule of law and accountability. And that's something that I've spent a decent amount of my career trying to advance.
Yeah, you've mentioned impunity, and that is one of the big issues of our time, just how many journalists are murdered and absolutely nothing ends up happening. And that's a really extraordinary fact in the world. Ted, let's turn back to the US for a moment. You were very successful in representing Jim Acosta at CNN and Brian Graham at Playboy when the Trump administration denied their White House press credentials, and you came back in and got them restored. And then also last May and June, Department of Justice notified CNN and the New York Times, Washington Post that back in the Trump administration, there'd been a secret authorization to seize reporters' phone and email logs. That was part of a national security leaks investigation. So I guess my question is, are those kinds of attacks behind us with Biden and Garland as AG, or are those kinds of things going to kind of come up through the institutional system anyway?
I don't think it's over. I think the Biden administration reacted correctly in saying we're not going to do this anymore. And as I mentioned, they changed the guidelines for seeking confidential source information from reporters, which was terrific. The Reporters Committee played a big role in that. But the problem is the next attorney general and the next president could just do away with all that happened. And that's really in the Obama administration, when they went overboard, Attorney General Holder improved the Justice Department guidelines. Then the Trump administration ignored them, flouted them. And so what we need is legislation. We need Congress to enact a statute that protects journalists. The other thing I'm worried about, the Julian Assange indictment is still on the books. It came out during the Trump administration. It basically would criminalize reporting, even though whatever you think of Julian Assange, the way the crime is defined, encouraging someone to leak national security information is what journalists do. So the Biden administration has not, as far as I know, pulled back from that. So the dangers are still there. We need to be very vigilant.
Right, and I think Reporters Committee has taken a kind of a narrow position here. We're not taking a broad position on Assange and some of the other aspects of it, but the part that criminalizes publishing national security information would be incredibly damaging to the press, and something Reporters Committee has worked on. So let's talk about judges for a moment, because both of you have a lot of experiences with judges, both here and elsewhere. there's certainly a newer generation of judges in the US, both state and federal, who anecdotally and looking at opinions don't seem to be especially sympathetic towards the news media. I guess I'll start with Ted. Do you have a sense that judges have less of an understanding of what journalists do and why their work is important than they used to? And is there anything either we as journalists or you as lawyers can do to try to correct that?
I do feel that way. I feel that there's been a corrosive effect, including because of the rhetoric like President Trump uses, and that judges have forgotten what journalists do, the actual work that journalists do, and that seeps into decision making. Not with all judges, but if you look at the opinions from Justice Gorsuch and Justice Thomas, and there was just Judge Silverman, the conservative icon himself, called for Times versus Sullivan to be overturned, and they clearly do not understand what the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal and Reuters and everybody does. They do not understand that these reporters are working hard to gather facts and report them to the public. They've bought into the notion, some of them, that it's all politics, all a partisan thing. And that's just not true. So I think we need to persuade judges, we need to remind judges and engage with judges, not just in access cases or subpoena battles or defamation cases, to have a dialogue and remind them what journalism is all about and how important it is to our system of government.
Yeah. Maybe I'll start with Amal on this because it is something that has always concerned me as a journalist. Do you see the media partly to blame for the current level of distrust, both in the public and the judiciary? And are there things the press should do to work differently and perhaps rebuild that trust?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's definitely some media outlets that are taking their journalistic ethics more seriously than others. But I think, in terms of judges, what I see, because I'm looking at, judges in very different systems around the world. And sometimes the starting point is atrocious because the laws on their face are criminalizing speech incredibly broadly. For instance, the 84 jurisdictions where blasphemy is a crime and the 5 jurisdictions where it's an offense that carries the death penalty. Sometimes it's what the law says on paper that's the problem. But in many systems, you just see compliant or corrupt judges allowing courtrooms to become tools of government propaganda. And I've seen that in many places, unfortunately. And so all of these measures that we talked about earlier in terms of, keeping a spotlight and making sure there are consequences and sanctions imposed for bad behavior, I think that applies just as much to police and prosecutors and judges as it does to politicians. And it's one of the reasons my foundation started a project called Trial Watch, because we were inspired by that Supreme Court justice who said sunlight is the best disinfectant. And we realized that so many abuses that take place in courtrooms around the world take place in the dark. And obviously what happens in court can lead to someone being in prison for life or executed. So there's a lot at stake, but even when a case is covered, people are there on day one or the last day, no one's really following what's happening. And so we are trying to be in every courtroom in which a journalist is being prosecuted as a result of their work. And where we see abuses, we expose them, we give the trial a grade, so it will get an F if it deserves one. We are working towards building a justice index so that all systems can be ranked according to their level of fairness, and then we fight for the rights of the unjustly imprisoned, and hopefully over time want to see systemic changes by removing some of these unfair laws and exposing and penalizing the practices that are really dangerous today for journalists and other vulnerable communities.
And I do want to note the work that we did together and the extraordinary work you did. The Myanmar judiciary had convicted 2 Reuters reporters, Walon and Chasa U, on absolutely ridiculous manufactured evidence. And you came in and you did a tremendous job helping us get them released. But it was also really important in that case to see that the world was watching, the press, because it was a high profile case, and in part because of your involvement. People were in the courtroom all the time. And when they came out of the courtroom, they were surrounded by by microphones and cameras. And that just put a level of intense scrutiny on that case that I think helped a lot. So I want to thank you for the work you did on that.
Well, thank you. It was an extraordinary privilege. And I think about that case a lot. In fact, I read the children's book that one of the Reuters reporters wrote while in prison, which appears in the Myanmar and English language with a couple of typos even. But it's the best children's book that I've read to them, because it tells kids about the importance of asking questions and challenging authority. And I think it presents that beautifully. But it was I'm so heartened to know they're now safe in a third country. They were able to get out. And I think you're right. I think in that case, publicity and that, sunlight was a necessary step. I don't think it would have been sufficient to change the outcome, as we know many other steps needed to be taken. But, what it also shows, first of all, is how often you're in this absolutely maddening situation where there are awful crimes being committed in the country. In this case, Myanmar, it's genocide. Those who are committing the crimes are free, and those who are reporting on them are imprisoned. And I thought it was extraordinary, because there was a moment in the case, as you know, where they were offered a deal where they said, okay, if you don't go through with publishing the story, you can get out. And these are guys with families, with, one of them's wife was pregnant, and they said no, because they wanted to fight for the truth. And good for you, Reuters, you published it while they were in prison. And I thought that whole, sort of human side of the case that I got an insight into was just extraordinary. But how many journalists have a news organization like Reuters behind them that was able to bring in, a team of lawyers and other experts, and what is happening to the rest?
Yeah, well, Trial Watch, I think, will help with that. And by the way, Wallone will be thrilled to hear that you're using his book as bedtime.
I sent him a photo of me reading the book to my daughter Ella while he was still in prison, and he did say it made him very happy.
Let's just close. I want to ask both of you, because we've talked about so many difficulties and so many threats. Is there anything that gives you hope about the future of the free press, both in the US and abroad? Ted, why don't you start?
What gives me hope is, I think, the fact that we've seen such incredible journalism. And again, we've been talking about the last 4 or 5 years in particular. It's been amazing. Financial journalism about the government, journalism about what's happening in the world, in Afghanistan. So I don't, you could tell me, Steve, what you think, but I don't think we've ever had finer journalism, more fine journalism being produced, notwithstanding all these obstacles, notwithstanding the war on the press from the President of the United States, notwithstanding what's happening in these other countries and things that Amal has been battling. So that gives me a lot of hope. I also think, notwithstanding the fact that I think judges are disconnected a bit from what journalism is and how important it is, we still get very strong opinions from courts. I represent MSNBC and Rachel Maddow in a case in the Ninth Circuit that One American News Network filed against him, which was a bizarre thing to have a news network suing journalists. And the Ninth Circuit issued a very strong opinion protecting opinion and hyperbole and commentary. And it was an ideologically mixed panel of judges. So it's not just liberal and conservative. So that gives me a lot of hope as well. The judges applying the law, journalists doing great work. So I think we have a lot to be hopeful for.
Amal?
Well, my name means hope, so I have to be hopeful no matter what the data says and the experience shows. No, look, I'm hopeful, really for two reasons. One is I think this administration is taking a very different approach to these issues than the previous one. And I think America can change the world. And if there's a concerted effort to also work with allies like the EU and other democracies, I think we can see a reversal of some of the, the trends and abuses that we've been talking about and are still worried about. And the second thing is just the clients that I have and the people that I meet show such extraordinary courage that I can't help but be optimistic. And it's, every case I represented, for example, a female journalist in Azerbaijan who they had actually put a camera in her bedroom and released footage of her. They then filed all these lawsuits against her. The day she comes out of prison, 1 minute after she comes out, she gives an interview and, you know, speaks her mind. And I'm thinking, oh dear, this could happen all over again. You know, Maria Ressa, who we talked about earlier, she's fighting because she said she's holding the ceiling up for every other journalist. And if she goes down, you know, what will that mean for others? And just count, you know, Wallone and Chester, we got so many that we see all over the world who are facing unbelievable threats and yet are determined to keep going for the sake of the truth and at such a high cost for themselves. And I think, you know, we owe them as lawyers, we owe it to them to do what we can, and you know, politicians of course have to do the same. And so I hope we'll see those who are making lofty speeches about democracy and human rights and freedom of the press. You know, it's really time that we see that turn into concerted action because these journalists really deserve better.
Yeah. I think it's a great point. I just would like to echo that, because I'm always amazed when I see what journalists do and the risks they take and the difficult process of getting information and then reporting it when you know you could be attacked, you could be imprisoned, you could be killed. It's incredible, and it is, in terms of the human spirit, it's inspiring.
Yeah. Well, listen, let me thank both of you, both on behalf of Reporters Committee, and I know journalists everywhere. We're all so grateful for all you do for your clients, for journalism, for press freedom. You know, and we're really honored to be able to honor you, because you're just two of the great advocates for press freedom in the world. So thank you for joining us, and thank you for all you do. And Amal and Ted, you have all of our gratitude. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you for what you do.
Yes.